Mob bosses control everything. Territory, money, who lives, who dies. They build empires on fear, corruption, and the absolute belief that they are above the law. But there is one thing even the most powerful crime lord cannot control: the judgment of the state. For a select few, the ultimate authority wasn't a rival's bullet. It was the state-sanctioned ticking of a clock. While we often think mobsters are untouchable, these men found themselves stripped of their expensive suits and nicknames, facing a reality they couldn't bribe or intimidate. It's a controversial chapter of true crime because it forces us to ask, does executing the boss actually break down an empire? Or does it just create a martyr for the next generation? In this video, you'll see how these men, who operated above the law for decades, were finally brought beneath it in the most absolute way possible. This is a journey from the peak of criminal power to its ultimate, inescapable consequence. You'll hear the facts of their crimes, the appeals that couldn't save them, and how exactly their reigns came to a permanent end. Section 1. Louis Buchalter. On March 4, 1944, at 11:16 p.m., Louis Lepke Buchalter became the first and only major organized crime boss in American history to be executed by the state. Buchalter was the head of Murder, Inc., the enforcement faction of the National Crime Syndicate, responsible for an estimated 400 to 1,000 murders across the United States. Lepke ruled with terror and brutality, and his power was built on more than violence. Lepke mastered labor racketeering, seizing control of key garment and baking unions in New York. Through extortion, he was able to take in millions from terrified business owners. He transformed labor racketeering into an art form, and for years he operated without consequences, protected by a code of silence and corrupt officials. His downfall came not from this empire of crime, but from a single, sloppy murder. The 1936 killing of Brooklyn candy store owner Joseph Rosen. Former FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover personally headed the manhunt that ended with Buchalter's surrender. His conviction guaranteed one thing: he would be treated not as a kingpin, but as a common murderer. Louis Buchalter was born on February 6, 1897, in Manhattan's Lower East Side, the youngest of 11 children in a struggling Jewish immigrant family from Austria-Hungary. His father, Barnett, a hardware store owner, died when Louis was 13, leaving the family with a bad financial situation. His mother, Rose, tried her best to keep her youngest son on the straight path, but the streets of the Lower East Side had different plans. The nickname Lepke, Yiddish for Little Louis, was a nickname his mother used affectionately, but it would become one of the most feared names in American organized crime. Lepke quit school after 8th grade and was quickly pulled toward the neighborhood's thriving criminal underworld. By his late teens, he already had multiple arrests for burglary and assault, serving his first significant prison term at the Sing Sing prison from 1916 to 1917 for attempted burglary. During the early 1920s, Lepke formed a partnership that would define his criminal career. An alliance with Jacob Gura Shapiro, another Lower East Side tough. The pair started as labor sluggers, enforcers hired to intimidate workers during union troubles. But Lepke possessed something rare among street criminals: a sophisticated business mind. He recognized that the real money wasn't in working for others, but in controlling the labor unions themselves. Lepke saw industrial extortion as a system rather than an isolated crime. While other gangsters were satisfied with protection rackets and bootlegging during the Prohibition, Lepke studied the garment industry's economics, identifying every pressure point where organized crime could insert itself. He understood that by controlling both unions and employer associations, he could take payment from every level of an industry. By the late 1920s, Buchalter and Shapiro had established dominance over unions representing bakers, flour truckers, garment workers, and clothing manufacturers. Their method was brutally effective. Threaten strikes that would cripple businesses, then offer protection services to prevent those same strikes. Businesses paid or faced beatings, acid thrown on merchandise, and worse. Workers who resisted found themselves unemployed or hospitalized. Unlike the flashy gangsters who attracted attention with their lifestyles, Lepke maintained a relatively modest public profile. He lived comfortably, but was not showy, preferring to operate from the shadows. He married Betty Wasserman in 1939, and they had a son, presenting the front of a legitimate businessman. Associates described him as soft-spoken, almost gentle in demeanor, until business required otherwise. What truly distinguished Buchalter was his creation of Murder Incorporated, though he never used that name. This was the enforcement division of the National Crime Syndicate, a loose confederation of major crime families. When the mob needed someone eliminated, Lepke's organization provided the service. His killers were professionals. Albert Anastasia, Abe Kid Twist Relis, Martin Bugsy Goldstein, and Harry Pittsburgh Phil Strauss among them. They murdered when needed, often traveling to distant cities to execute contracts, creating no obvious connection between killer and victim. The early 1930s represented Lepke Buchalter's apex of power. His labor rackets generated an estimated $10 million per year, around $200 million in today's currency. He controlled entire industries, and his word could shut down New York's garment district within hours. But this same period planted the seeds of his destruction. The labor racketeering had grown too visible, too damaging to ignore. New York County District Attorney Thomas E. Dewey, an ambitious prosecutor with political aspirations, made organized crime his primary target. Dewey represented a new breed of prosecutor, methodical, incorruptible, and willing to use new legal strategies. He assembled a team of investigators and attorneys dedicated to taking down the mob's labor empire. At the same time, the federal government began pursuing Buchalter through a different route. In the mid-1930s, federal authorities indicted him on narcotics trafficking charges related to a massive heroin smuggling operation. The evidence was substantial. Buchalter had expanded beyond labor racketeering into the international drug trade, importing heroin from China and distributing it through his network. Additional federal charges for violations in the rabbit skin processing industry further complicated his legal situation. The pressure escalated dramatically in 1937. Rather than face arrest, Buchalter made a decision. He disappeared and ran away from the law. For a man who'd always operated through messengers, this was extraordinary. Lepke went underground in New York City, moving between safe houses, constantly changing locations, while his attorney and messengers maintained contact with his organization. But going into hiding created new problems. With Buchalter off the streets, law enforcement intensified pressure on his entire organization. His associates were arrested, and businesses that had paid protection money to Lepke's organization were raided and shut down. The entire infrastructure that generated his wealth began to weaken. His fellow mob bosses now grew concerned. Lepke's status was bringing unwanted heat on all organized crime operations. During his time underground, Buchalter became convinced that certain witnesses from his past posed a present threat. Among them was Joseph Rosen, a former trucker Buchalter had forced out of business years earlier. Rosen had made threatening statements about testifying against Lepke, though whether he actually would have done so remains unclear. From hiding, Buchalter ordered Rosen's murder, a decision that would eventually send him to his death. In the early 1930s, Joseph Rosen operated a modest trucking business serving garment manufacturers. He was a hard-working man with a family, trying to earn an honest living in an industry controlled by organized crime. When Buchalter and Shapiro took control over garment trucking, they demanded that independent operators either pay tribute or get out. Those who refused faced violence, sabotage, and economic destruction. Rosen initially tried to resist, but Buchalter's organization made resistance impossible. Trucks were vandalized, shipments hijacked, and customers intimidated into refusing Rosen's services. By 1932, Rosen's business had been destroyed. He was forced into bankruptcy, losing everything he'd built. Reduced to poverty, he eventually opened a small candy store in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn. But Rosen couldn't let go of his bitterness. He talked openly about what Buchalter had done to him, and more dangerously, he spoke about potentially testifying against Lepke if given the opportunity. These weren't idle threats made to authorities. They were complaints made to neighbors, friends, and acquaintances. In a neighborhood where everyone knew someone connected to organized crime, such talk reached Buchalter's ears. For years, Buchalter ignored Rosen. But in 1936, with prosecutors investigating his labor rackets and Lepke himself hiding from federal narcotics charges, Rosen's potential testimony transformed from nuisance to threat. Buchalter became convinced, possibly correctly, possibly through paranoia, that District Attorney Thomas Dewey was building a case using Rosen as a witness. Regardless, from his hiding place, Buchalter gave the order. Albert Tannenbaum, one of Murder Inc.'s most reliable killers, later testified about receiving instructions from Lepke through his messengers. The message was clear. Joseph Rosen needed to be eliminated before he could testify. The contract was assigned to a team of proven executioners: Emanuel Mendy Weiss, Louis Capone, and Pittsburgh Phil Strauss. All experienced killers who'd carried out numerous contracts for the organization. The killers surveilled Rosen's candy store at 725 Sutter Avenue in Brownsville, learning his routines and identifying the ideal time for the hit. September 13th, 1936, was selected as the date, a Sunday morning when the store would be relatively quiet and witnesses were minimal. On that morning, Rosen arrived at his store around 7:30 a.m., preparing for the day's business. What happened next was characteristic of Murder Inc.'s brutal efficiency. Multiple shooters opened fire simultaneously, hitting Rosen 17 times with .38 caliber pistols and a .32 caliber weapon. The overkill was intentional, not just to ensure death, but to send a message. Rosen died instantly, his body riddled with bullets, collapsing behind his own candy counter. The killers fled the scene in a stolen car that was later abandoned and burned. The execution had taken less than a minute. Witnesses heard gunshots, but saw little useful detail. The hit team had worn hats and long coats, despite the September warmth, hiding their features. The initial investigation went nowhere. This was Brownsville, where cooperation with police was minimal under the best circumstances. The murder appeared to be another mob killing in a neighborhood where such things happened occasionally. Without witnesses willing to talk, and without obvious physical evidence, detectives had little to pursue. The case went cold. But Buchalter had miscalculated terribly. Killing Rosen didn't eliminate the threat. It created a far more dangerous one. First, the murder itself created more heat on Buchalter's organization. Second, and far more importantly, the killing would later become the specific crime for which prosecutors could pursue a murder charge with the death penalty. Labor racketeering, narcotics trafficking, and antitrust violations carried prison sentences. Murder carried the electric chair. Moreover, Buchalter had created witnesses to his own crime through the very structure he'd built. Murder Inc. operated through layers of messengers. But that meant multiple people knew about the Rosen contract. Albert Tannenbaum knew because he'd helped coordinate it. Abe Rellis knew because he'd been involved in numerous Murder Inc. operations. These men weren't loyal soldiers. They were career criminals who would eventually face their own legal problems. In the months following Rosen's murder, Buchalter ordered additional killings of other potential witnesses. Harry Big Greenie Greenberg, a former associate who knew too much and had become unstable, was murdered in Los Angeles in 1939. A garment manufacturer named Morris Diamond disappeared. These killings followed the same pattern: eliminate anyone who might testify. But each murder created new witnesses. The people who carried out the hits, the people who arranged them, the people who knew about them. The breakthrough in the Rosen case came from an unexpected source: Abe "Kid Twist" Rellis, one of Murder Inc.'s most prolific killers. In November 1940, facing multiple murder charges himself, Relis decided to talk. Relis's cooperation changed the entire investigation. The Code of Omerta, silence at all costs, had protected organized crime for decades. But Relis, facing the electric chair for his own crimes, chose survival. In exchange for testimony against his former associates, prosecutors offered him protection and the possibility of avoiding execution. What Relis provided was detailed insider knowledge of Murder Inc.'s operations, including specific murders, the organizational structure, and, most importantly, the chain of command that led directly to Lepke Buchalter. Brooklyn District Attorney William O'Dwyer and his assistant Burton Turkis had been building cases against Murder Inc.'s lower-level operators for months. Relis's statements gave them everything they needed to reach the organization's leadership. Relis described a murder-for-hire enterprise with contracts issued from the top and carried out by specialists. Regarding the Rosen murder specifically, Relis provided the complete narrative. He identified the killers: Mendy Weiss, Pittsburgh Phil Strauss, and others. More importantly, he traced the order back through the chain of command to Buchalter himself. Albert Tannenbaum, another Murder Inc. killer whom prosecutors flipped, had the same statement with Relis. Tannenbaum had been closer to Buchalter and could testify directly about receiving orders related to Rosen's elimination. The investigation expanded as other members of Murder Inc. began cooperating. Ali Tick-Tock Tannenbaum, Sholem Bernstein, and others provided pieces of the puzzle. Each confession created a detailed picture of the organization's operations. Prosecutors now possessed something previously unimaginable: multiple insiders willing to testify about the mob's most closely guarded secrets. Meanwhile, Buchalter's situation had already deteriorated dramatically before the Rosen murder investigation gained traction. The FBI manhunt had intensified to the point where other mob bosses viewed him as a liability. Meyer Lansky and other organized crime leaders began pressuring Buchalter to surrender, arguing that his continued avoidance of the law was damaging everyone's operations. In August 1939, through representatives, J. Edgar Hoover negotiated Buchalter's surrender with a condition: he would face only federal charges, not state murder charges. This arrangement was designed to end the manhunt while keeping Buchalter away from the death penalty. On August 24, 1939, Buchalter surrendered to FBI Director Hoover and gossip columnist Walter Winchell on a New York street corner. Buchalter believed the deal protected him from the most serious charges. He was wrong. Federal authorities convicted him on narcotics trafficking charges in December 1939, sentencing him to 14 years in Leavenworth Penitentiary. But even as he began serving federal time, Brooklyn prosecutors were building the murder case. The investigation into Rosen's death now had strong new evidence. Witnesses had been located who'd seen the killers before and after the shooting. Ballistics evidence was analyzed. More importantly, the testimony of Relis, Tannenbaum, and others provided direct evidence of Buchalter's involvement. By 1941, prosecutors felt confident they had sufficient evidence for a murder case. The trial of Louis Buchalter for Joseph Rosen's murder began in October 1941 in Brooklyn's Kings County Court. Alongside Buchalter were Emanuel Mendy Weiss and Louis Capone, two of the actual triggermen. The prosecution team, led by Burton Turkis, faced the challenging task of proving that a defendant who wasn't present at the murder scene and didn't pull the trigger was the one guilty of first-degree murder. The case relied on testimony from admitted killers, Abe Relis, Albert Tannenbaum, and others who'd turned state's evidence. When Relis said the murder happened on a specific date at a specific location, crime scene evidence confirmed it. When Tannenbaum described the getaway car, witnesses confirmed such a vehicle. The criminal informants weren't just telling stories. Their accounts matched verifiable facts. The testimony was devastating for Lepke. Relis described Murder Inc.'s operations as if discussing a legitimate business. He explained how contracts worked, how assignments were distributed, how payment was arranged. He detailed dozens of murders, but it was Tannenbaum who provided the clear link to Buchalter. He testified that he'd received direct instructions from Lepke regarding problems with potential witnesses, and that Rosen's name had been specifically mentioned. He described meetings where Buchalter expressed concern about Rosen's potential testimony and indicated that the problem needed to be taken care of. The defense attempted to argue that Buchalter had merely expressed frustration about Rosen, not ordered his murder, that subordinates had acted without explicit authorization. But prosecutors demonstrated through multiple witnesses that in Murder Inc.'s structure, no significant hit occurred without approval from the top. Buchalter's organization operated with clear hierarchy and discipline. Freelance killings didn't happen. One powerful element of the prosecution's case was establishing motive. Prosecutors detailed how Rosen represented a threat to Buchalter's labor racketeering empire. They showed jury members Rosen's bankrupt business records, showed how Buchalter's organization had destroyed his livelihood, and established that Rosen had made statements about potential testimony. The narrative was clear. Buchalter eliminated a witness to protect his criminal empire. After deliberating for approximately 10 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts against all three defendants on November 30th, 1941. The conviction was for first-degree murder, which carried a mandatory death sentence. Judge Franklin Taylor pronounced sentence: death by electrocution at Sing Sing Prison. The date was set, then postponed multiple times due to appeals. The appeals process extended for over 2 years. Buchalter's attorneys challenged every aspect of the conviction, but each and every appeal was denied. The New York Court of Appeals stayed firm with the conviction. The United States Supreme Court declined to hear the case. The death sentence pronounced on Louis Buchalter represented more than justice for a single murder. It was a statement about accountability for organized crime's leadership, that those who ordered killings while insulating themselves from direct involvement could still face the ultimate penalty. For Joseph Rosen's family, the conviction brought a measure of justice, but couldn't restore what they'd lost. Rosen had been murdered not for anything he'd done, but for something Buchalter feared he might do. His widow was left to raise their children alone, the family business destroyed years before by the same man who'd ultimately ordered the murder. During the trial, testimony about Rosen's life painted a picture of a decent man destroyed by forces that were beyond his control. The statements came through in prosecutor Burton Turkis's arguments. He emphasized that Rosen represented every ordinary citizen terrorized by organized crime, every small business owner extorted, every worker intimidated by mob-controlled unions. The Rosen murder wasn't an isolated crime. It was the end of a criminal enterprise built on violence and fear. As Buchalter exhausted his appeals, he maintained hope that his sentence might be reduced. He believed his extensive knowledge of organized crime operations might be traded for his life. He reportedly offered to provide information about mob activities, corruption, and unsolved murders. But prosecutors and government officials recognized that making such a deal would send a catastrophic message, that even conviction and death sentences could be negotiated away by powerful criminals. The final months before execution saw frantic legal maneuvering. Buchalter's attorneys filed habeas corpus petitions, sought executive clemency, and pursued every available legal avenue. New York Governor Thomas Dewey, the same prosecutor who'd originally pursued Buchalter years earlier, reviewed clemency appeals and denied them. Dewey, now governor with presidential aspirations, understood that showing leniency to Buchalter would be political suicide. Emanuel Weiss and Louis Capone, convicted alongside Buchalter, faced the same fate. Their legal appeals were similarly exhausted. Unlike Buchalter, they had no information valuable enough to potentially trade for their sentences. They'd been the triggermen, while Buchalter had been the boss who gave the order. Yet all three would die together. In the final days, Buchalter was transferred to Sing Sing's death house, the same prison where he'd served time as a young man for burglary. The condemned cell was a small room where he awaited execution. On the evening of March 4th, 1944, Louis Buchalter entered Sing Sing's execution chamber at approximately 11 p.m. He was 57 years old, considerably aged by years of stress and incarceration. Emmanuel Weiss entered first, executed at 11:02 p.m. Louis Capone followed at 11:07 p.m. Buchalter went last, sitting in the electric chair at 11:13 p.m. Witnesses reported that Buchalter appeared calm, accepting his fate. He made no final statement beyond a brief comment to his rabbi. At 11:16 p.m., the executioner pulled the switch, sending approximately 2,000 volts through Buchalter's body. He was pronounced dead minutes later, becoming the first and only major organized crime boss to be executed by the United States government. The execution marked a turning point in the battle against organized crime. It demonstrated that mob leadership could be held accountable, that the wall of silence could be breached through determined prosecution, and the testimony of insiders seeking self-preservation. The techniques used to convict Buchalter, flipping witnesses, building corroborating evidence, pursuing leadership through conspiracy laws, became standard tools in prosecuting organized crime. Murder, Inc. effectively ceased to exist following the convictions and executions coming from Abe Relis's testimony. Many of its members were executed or imprisoned for life. The National Crime Syndicate continued, but became more cautious about sanctioning murders, recognizing that each killing created potential witnesses. The process of witness elimination had proven too dangerous. Buchalter's story is a tale of caution. He built a criminal empire through innovation and brutality, but his paranoid elimination of witnesses ultimately provided the state with the evidence needed to execute him. Today, his name appears in history as an example of organized crime's reach during the early 20th century and its eventual downfall to American justice. The murder of Joseph Rosen, intended to silence a witness, instead became the crime that spoke the loudest, sealing Lepke Buchalter's place in history as the mob boss who couldn't escape the electric chair. In southern Illinois, another man's reign of terror would cause him to meet the same fate that Lepke did. Section 2. Charles Berger. On April 19, 1928, at precisely 9:52 a.m., Charles Berger climbed 13 steps to a wooden gallows in the Franklin County Jail Yard in Benton, Illinois, with thousands of spectators crowding the streets outside. As the noose was placed around his neck, Berger shook hands with the hangman and uttered his final words. Charles Berger was a complex figure who commanded genuine loyalty from his followers, fought battles with the Ku Klux Klan, and turned the backwoods of southern Illinois into a war zone during the bloody gang conflicts of the 1920s. His execution for ordering the murder of West City Mayor Joe Adams marked the end of an era of lawlessness and violence that had seen Tommy gun battles, armored car assaults, and what many historians consider America's first aerial bombing. What makes Berger's case particularly compelling is the irony of his downfall. While he survived years of brutal gang warfare with the rival Shelton brothers, escaped numerous murder attempts, and masterminded countless violent crimes, it was a single, politically motivated assassination that sent him to his death. Berger's journey from immigrant street tough to executed crime boss represents a unique story of ambition, violence, and ultimate justice. Shakhnai Itzik Berger was born on February 5, 1881, in the Russian Empire, likely in what is now Ukraine, to Jewish parents. His family immigrated to the United States when he was a young child, settling in the St. Louis area, where thousands of Eastern European Jewish immigrants had established communities. His first name, Shakna, was Americanized and became Charles, though friends would later call him Charlie. Berger's early life followed a familiar immigrant pattern: poverty, limited education, and early exposure to street crime. By his teenage years, he'd already developed a reputation as a tough, fearless fighter, willing to use violence to settle disputes. Unlike many immigrants who found legitimate work in factories or shops, Berger was pulled toward the world of crime. He worked as a bouncer, street enforcer, and became a petty criminal throughout his youth in St. Louis. His criminal career was interrupted by an unexpected event: military service. Berger later enlisted in the U.S. Army. He saw combat, earned commendations for bravery, and developed skills that would later prove useful in his criminal enterprises: weapons proficiency, tactical thinking, and leadership ability. After his military discharge, Berger returned to civilian life, but struggled to find legitimate employment that matched the excitement and authority he'd experienced in the service. He moved through various jobs, married, and had children, but the conventional life never suited him. By the early 1920s, Berger had relocated to southern Illinois, specifically the rough coal mining region around Williamson County, an area that would become known as Bloody Williamson for the violence that erupted there. Southern Illinois during Prohibition was an unusual place. Geographically and culturally isolated from Chicago to the north and St. Louis to the west, the region developed its own criminal environment. Coal mining towns were populated by hard-drinking workers with money to spend. The area, heavily forested hills, hidden hollows, and poorly patrolled back roads, was perfect for illegal activities. Local law enforcement was understaffed, underpaid, and often corrupt. Berger initially operated an inn called Shady Rest outside Harrisburg, Illinois. On the surface, it was a legitimate tavern and inn. In reality, it served as headquarters for a bootlegging and gambling operation. But Berger brought something different to the typical operation: military-style organization and discipline. He recruited a gang of loyal followers, many of them war veterans like himself, and ran his operation with chain-of-command structure. His men were well-armed, well-paid, and fiercely loyal. What distinguished Berger from other gangsters was his public appearance. He genuinely opposed the Ku Klux Klan, an American racist hate group which was extremely powerful in southern Illinois during the 1920s. When the Klan targeted Jewish businesses or terrorized black residents, Berger intervened, sometimes violently. This earned him genuine support from parts of the population who saw him as a protector against Klan violence. Even as he ran illegal operations, he was generous to the poor, providing coal to needy families and food during hard times, building a Robin Hood-style reputation. But Berger was also ruthless. When crossed, he responded with overwhelming violence. When rival bootleggers approached his territory, he organized military-style assaults. When law enforcement officers couldn't be bribed, they were threatened or eliminated. Berger understood that in the lawless environment of Prohibition-era Southern Illinois, power came from the willingness to use violence more effectively than your enemies. Became one of the most violent criminal conflicts in American history, the Berger-Shelton Gang War. The Shelton brothers, Carl, Bernie, and Earl, operated a rival bootlegging empire in southern Illinois. Initially, Berger and the Sheltons had been allies, even partners in some operations. But as Prohibition generated bigger profits, territorial issues became unavoidable. The breaking point came in 1926, when the two factions could no longer exist together. What followed was open warfare that shocked even hardened observers of Prohibition violence. The combatants didn't just carry pistols. They had Thompson submachine guns, grenades, and even armored vehicles. Berger's headquarters, Shady Rest, was fortified like a military installation with sandbags, machine gun nests, and lookout posts. On November 12, 1926, the violence reached a horrifying new level. A small airplane appeared over Shady Rest and dropped homemade bombs on Berger's compound. While the crude explosives caused minimal damage, the attack represented America's first aerial bombing and demonstrated how far the gang war had escalated. As expected, Berger fought back. His gang ambushed Shelton operations, hijacked their liquor shipments, and engaged in street battles that left bodies scattered across southern Illinois. On January 24, 1927, Berger's men launched an assault on the Shelton brothers' headquarters in Collinsville, attacking with machine guns and explosives. The battle went on for hours before police intervened, but the gang war had created a problem that extended beyond the combatants. It was destroying the region's economy and reputation. Legitimate businesses suffered. Tourism collapsed. National newspapers wrote sensational stories about Bloody Williamson and the lawlessness consuming southern Illinois. State and federal authorities faced increasing pressure to restore order. Various political figures were now trying to navigate between the gangs, law enforcement, and public pressure. Among them was Joe Adams, the mayor of West City, Illinois, a small coal mining town in Franklin County. Some people saw him as a reformer trying to clean up corruption. Others viewed him as a politician playing both sides. What's certain is that Adams had deals with both the Burger and Shelton organizations. By late 1926, Adams had become a problem for Burger. The mayor possessed information about Burger's operations and had made threatening statements about cooperating with state investigators. More problematically, Adams had apparently shifted his loyalties toward the Shelton brothers, or at least that's what Burger believed. In the paranoid atmosphere of the gang war, betrayal carried a death sentence. Burger held a meeting with his top lieutenants, Art Newman, Elmo Thomason, Ray Highland, and others. According to later testimony, Burger explicitly ordered Adams's assassination. This wasn't a spontaneous decision made in anger. It was a calculated elimination of a political threat. Burger allegedly provided specific instructions. Adams should be killed in a way that sent a message, and the murder should occur when it would have maximum impact. The choice to kill a sitting mayor escalated tensions in the area even more. Bootleggers killing rival bootleggers was expected during the Prohibition. Even killing corrupt police officers or informants, while serious, was understood as part of the criminal underworld's internal business. But assassinating an elected official, regardless of his character or corruption, crossed a line that would bring down the full weight of the state legal system. What Burger failed to see was how his gang war had affected his protection. Previously, his political connections, public support from anti-Klan communities, and the general corruption of local law enforcement had protected him from serious legal consequences. But the escalating violence had forced state officials in Springfield to take action. The Illinois State's Attorney's Office had assigned special prosecutors to investigate the gang wars. Evidence was being compiled. Witnesses were being interviewed. On the other hand, loyalty within Burger's organization was beginning to crack. The constant violence, the pressure from law enforcement, and the very real possibility of death or long prison sentences made some gang members reconsider their choices. Men who'd been loyal soldiers began to think about cooperating with authorities in exchange for a lighter sentence. These potential informants were time bombs within Burger's organization, and the Adams murder would give them something concrete to trade for their freedom. On December 12, 1926, Mayor Joe Adams left his home in West City, Illinois, for what should have been a routine errand. Adams ran a small store in addition to his mayoral duties. That night, he planned to drive to a neighboring town on business. He would never complete that journey. According to the testimony that would later emerge at trial, Charles Burger had given explicit orders for Adams' elimination. The contract was assigned to some of Burger's most trusted enforcers: Elmo Thomason, Art Newman, Ray Highland, and Freddie Wooten. These were experienced gunmen who'd participated in numerous violent acts during the gang wars. They had experience with this type of work. They watched Adams for days, learning his routines and identifying the best location for the hit. They chose a stretch of road between West City and the neighboring town where Adams was headed, a rural area with limited witnesses and easy escape routes. As Adams drove along the darkened road, a vehicle suddenly pulled alongside him. Before the mayor could react, gunfire erupted. Multiple weapons opened fire simultaneously. Witnesses later reported hearing what sounded like a sustained burst of gunfire, suggesting at least one Thompson submachine gun was used alongside pistols or rifles. The rain of bullets shattered both Adams' car windows and his body. He was struck multiple times in the head, chest, and torso. His vehicle veered off the road and crashed. Adams died almost instantly, his body riddled with bullets, slumped over the steering wheel of his destroyed automobile. The murder scene was discovered within hours. A passing motorist found Adams's crashed vehicle and the mayor's bullet-filled body. Local law enforcement arrived and immediately recognized that this was an execution. The number of bullet holes, the ambush, and the victim's identity all pointed to organized crime involvement. Newspaper coverage was immediate and extensive. The Chicago Tribune, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and other major newspapers ran front-page stories about the murder of Mayor Adams in gangland-style execution. Public outrage intensified, and political pressure on Illinois Governor Len Small to address the lawlessness in Southern Illinois became overwhelming. State investigators arrived in Franklin County within days. Unlike previous investigations into prohibition violence, which local sheriffs could control or sabotage, this investigation was directed with resources and authority that local corruption couldn't disrupt. Ballistics experts examined the crime scene. Witnesses were interviewed. Most importantly, investigators began pressuring members of Bierger's gang, offering deals to anyone willing to testify. Evidence suggested the killers had conducted surveillance on Adams for at least a week. They'd identified his patterns, chosen the ambush location with care, and prepared their weapons specifically for the hit. The Thompson submachine gun, which left distinctive shell casings at the scene, could be traced back to weapons known to be in Bierger's possession. But direct physical evidence connecting Bierger himself to the murder was limited. He hadn't been at the scene. The weapons couldn't be linked to him personally. The getaway vehicle had been stolen and later burned. What prosecutors needed was testimony from someone who could place Bierger at the planning meetings, who could testify that Bierger specifically ordered Adams's assassination. What made the Adams murder particularly significant legally was that it involved conspiracy to commit murder, a capital offense in Illinois. Even though Bierger hadn't pulled the trigger, the prosecution would argue that ordering the killing made him equally guilty under the law. This legal theory, holding gang leaders responsible for murders they ordered but didn't personally commit, was new in the 1920s, but would later become important to prosecuting organized crime. The investigation into Mayor Joe Adams's murder represented a turning point in how Illinois authorities approached organized crime. Unlike previous cases hampered by local corruption and intimidated witnesses, this investigation had state-level authority, resources, and most importantly, political will. Governor Len Small, facing his own corruption allegations and desperate to demonstrate law and order credentials, personally directed state resources toward solving the Adams case. State Attorney Roy Martin, based in Franklin County, led the investigation. Martin understood that solving this case required breaking the code of silence that protected gangsters like Bierger. The strategy was straightforward. Arrest everyone associated with Bierger's gang, charge them with anything possible, and then offer deals to whoever talked first. Within weeks of the murder, arrests began. Art Newman was picked up on weapons charges. Elmo Thomason faced charges related to a separate shooting. Ray Highland was arrested for bootlegging violations. The men were separated, held in different facilities, and subjected to intensive interrogation. The investigation also uncovered evidence of widespread corruption. Testimony revealed that Bierger had paid off local sheriffs, judges, and even state officials. Bank records showed suspicious payments. Wiretaps, a new investigative technique, captured conversations between Bierger associates discussing how to handle the investigation. The case was expanding beyond a single murder and into the corruption of the system throughout southern Illinois. Bierger himself was arrested on January 24, 1927, at his inn, Shady Rest. Law enforcement approached with dozens of state police officers surrounding the property, and Bierger was given a simple choice: surrender or face an assault. Unlike during his battles with the Shelton brothers, Bierger recognized that fighting state police would be suicidal. He surrendered without resistance, reportedly making jokes as he was handcuffed and led away. The physical evidence collected from Shady Rest was substantial. Investigators seized an arsenal of weapons, including Thompson submachine guns, rifles, pistols, and explosives. Ballistics tests would later link some of these weapons to various murders, including the Adams killing. They also found detailed records of Bierger's operations, evidence of bootlegging income, payments to corrupt officials, and communications that would prove valuable at trial. The investigation also benefited from changing public reaction. The gang wars had exhausted the population's tolerance for violence. Residents who'd previously stayed silent, fearing retaliation, now came forward with information. Business owners testified about extortion. Former employees of Bierger's Roadhouse described activities they'd witnessed. The trial of Charles Bierger for the murder of Mayor Joe Adams began on April 11, 1928, in the Franklin County Courthouse in Benton, Illinois. The prosecution team was led by State Attorney Roy Martin, along with special prosecutors from the Illinois Attorney General's office. Jury selection proved to be difficult. Finding 12 unbiased jurors in a region where everyone knew about the Bierger-Shelton gang wars and had opinions about the participants was nearly impossible. Some admitted they'd already formed opinions about Bierger. Others had lost business due to the gang violence or had relatives affected by the warfare. Eventually, a jury was seated, though both sides still had concerns about fairness. The prosecution's opening statement presented a straightforward story. Charles Bierger, fearing that Mayor Joe Adams would cooperate with law enforcement, ordered his assassination. This was a calculated murder, planned in meetings at Bierger's headquarters, and executed by his subordinates following his explicit orders. Under Illinois law, the prosecution argued, the person who orders a murder is as guilty as the person who pulls the trigger. Charles Bierger himself testified, a risky decision that reflected his personality and confidence. On the stand, he denied ordering Adams' murder, claimed the witnesses were lying, and portrayed himself as a businessman operating in a violent industry where he had to defend himself and his employees. Bierger presented himself as more sophisticated than the typical gangster, but eventually prosecutors would expose contradictions and demonstrate his control over the organization. The prosecution also presented evidence of Bierger's violent history, previous murders connected to his organization, the military-style operations he commanded, and his reputation for eliminating anyone who posed a threat. While this evidence didn't directly prove the Adams murder, it established a pattern of behavior consistent with ordering assassinations. One particularly effective moment came when prosecutors introduced evidence about the weapons found at Shady Rest. Ballistics experts testified that shells recovered from the Adams murder scene matched weapons in Bierger's possession. While this didn't prove Bierger personally used the weapons, it demonstrated that the murder was committed with guns from his organization, supporting the testimony that it was a hit from Bierger's organization. On April 28, 1928, after discussing for several hours, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of murder. Bierger showed little emotion, though witnesses reported his face became pale. Under Illinois law, murder convictions carried a mandatory death sentence. Judge E.N. Bowen sentenced Charles Bierger to death by hanging. Unlike modern cases with extensive victim impact statements, the 1920s judicial system focused mainly on the crime and defendant. However, the impact of Joe Adams' murder extended far beyond the courtroom that day. Adams' widow attended much of the trial, and in later interviews with newspapers, she expressed relief that justice had been served, but noted that no legal proceeding could restore her husband or repair the damage to their family. But the Adams family's suffering represented only the most direct impact. The gang warfare that culminated in Adams's murder had terrorized Southern Illinois for years. Dozens of people had died in the Bierger-Shelton conflict. Businesses had closed. Families had fled the region. The murder of an elected official had been the final straw that forced legal and political systems to finally respond. During the sentencing hearing, prosecutors presented evidence of Bierger's broader criminal impact. They detailed other murders connected to his organization, though these weren't part of the formal charges. They described the systematic extortion that had drained millions from legitimate businesses. They outlined the corruption that had compromised law enforcement and local government. The Adams murder was presented not as an isolated crime, but as the inevitable result of allowing organized crime to operate with impunity. Birger himself showed little remorse during sentencing. He maintained his innocence and suggested he was being sacrificed to satisfy public demand. This defiance was characteristic of Birger's personality. Even facing death, he refused to admit his wrongdoings. The sentence stated that he would be hanged in the Franklin County Jail yard, and the execution would be public. Illinois law at the time allowed for public executions, though the practice was already becoming an issue. Birger's hanging would draw thousands of spectators and would ultimately become the last public execution in Illinois history. The sentencing also had broader effects on organized crime prosecution. The successful conviction of a gang leader for a murder he'd ordered but not personally committed established an important legal victory. Future prosecutors would then cite the Birger case when pursuing mob bosses for conspiracy to commit murder. The execution of Charles Birger occurred on April 19, 1928, just 3 weeks after his conviction. The speed reflected the era's different approach to capital punishment. Appeals were limited, and sentences were carried out relatively quickly compared to modern standards. Birger had filed appeals to the Illinois Supreme Court, but they were denied. Governor Len Small, despite receiving petitions, refused to intervene. On the morning of the execution, an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 people gathered outside the Franklin County Jail. Birger maintained his composure to the end. Dressed in a suit, he walked to the gallows without assistance. When offered the traditional white hood, he refused it with characteristic defiance, demanding a black hood instead. "I don't want people to think I belong to the Klan," he reportedly said, a reference to his battles against the Ku Klux Klan. His last words, "It's a beautiful world," were spoken with what witnesses described as genuine appreciation, a contrast to the violence that had defined his life. At 9:52 a.m., the trap door opened and Birger dropped. Birger's neck broke instantly, and he died within minutes. He was pronounced dead at 10:01 a.m. His body was cut down, placed in a coffin, and eventually buried in a Jewish cemetery in St. Louis. The execution marked the end of the Birger gang, but not the end of organized crime in southern Illinois. The Shelton brothers continued operating for years, though they too eventually faced legal consequences. The gang wars gradually weakened, partly because the prohibition was revoked, eliminating the primary source of conflict and profit. Birger's execution had lasting effects on Illinois law. The spectacle of thousands gathering to watch a man hang disturbed many observers, including lawmakers. Within a few years, Illinois banned public executions, and eventually the state abolished hanging in favor of the electric chair. Birger's execution thus represents a historical marker, the last public hanging in Illinois, and one of the last anywhere in the United States. Today, Charles Birger's legacy lives on primarily in regional history. Southern Illinois maintains a complex relationship with its violent past. Some view Birger as a folk hero who opposed the Klan and helped the poor, while others remember him as a ruthless criminal whose actions brought terror to the region. Historical markers note the locations of key events in the gang wars. The Franklin County Jail, where Birger was executed, still stands, now a museum that includes exhibits about his trial and execution. While Birger was publicly hanged as a spectacle, his trial quietly changed the law itself. Prosecutors proved that a boss giving the order was just as guilty as the man who pulled the trigger. A simple, powerful idea about conspiracy and leadership that would later on become the foundation for bringing down every major mob boss who came after him. Make sure to subscribe before the next story. Trust me, it's even more shocking than what you just heard. While Birger's fate was a public spectacle, the modern legal system found a more devastating use for the death penalty against a boss. Not to execute him, but to use it to break his sacred code of silence. Section 3. Joey Massino. As the boss of the Bonanno crime family, Joey Massino rebuilt a crumbling criminal empire, restored its power and influence, and earned a seat at the table of New York's five families. Unlike many mobsters whose violence was impulsive or emotional, Massino's brutality was calculated and strategic. Over decades, he planned murders, racketeering operations, and criminal conspiracies that generated millions of dollars while leaving a trail of bodies across New York. His criminal enterprise touched everything from illegal gambling and loan sharking to labor racketeering and drug trafficking. The rules he used to build his empire would lead to an unthinkable government threat. And later on, he would eventually make a decision that would create a historic break in the very foundation of the American Mafia and redefine what victory looked like. Like in the FBI's endless war on organized crime. Joseph Massino was born on January 10, 1943, in New York City, growing up in the working-class neighborhoods of Queens. Unlike the stereotypical poor mobster origin story, Massino came from a relatively stable family environment. However, the streets of his neighborhood were controlled by the mafia, and young Joseph was drawn to the power and respect commanded by local guys. He dropped out of high school and began working in laboring jobs, but his real education came from the streets. By his early 20s, Massino had become interested in the Bonanno crime family, one of New York's five families. He started as a truck hijacker, and quickly demonstrated the combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and earning ability that mobsters look for. In 1975, he became a member of the family, formally inducted into the mafia through the traditional blood oath ceremony. His mentor was Philip "Rusty" Rastelli, a powerful man who would later become boss of the family. Massino proved to be an exceptional earner, running various criminal operations, including illegal gambling rings, loan sharking businesses, and labor racketeering schemes. He opened legitimate businesses as fronts, including a catering company, and later the famous Casablanca restaurant in Maspeth, Queens, which would become an unofficial headquarters for Bonanno family operations. His awareness and ability to make good judgments earned him the nickname the Last Don and the Ear, due to his cautiousness about electronic surveillance. The Bonanno family had long been considered the weakest of New York's five families, marked by internal conflicts and federal investigations. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the family was torn apart by a brutal internal war between rival factions. Massino remained loyal to Rastelli throughout this period, even as his boss spent years in prison. This loyalty would prove important to his rise. During Rastelli's time in jail, Massino effectively ran the family's day-to-day operations. He was named a capo, controlling his own crew of soldiers and associates who conducted various criminal enterprises. His crews were disciplined, profitable, and protected from law enforcement. Massino was paranoid about surveillance, refusing to discuss business in his home or social clubs, instead holding meetings while walking on the street or in noisy public places where electronic bugs would be ineffective. His personal life seemed almost conventional by mafia standards. He married Josephine Vitale, whose brother Salvatore, good-looking Sal Vitale, would become Massino's underboss and closest confidant. The couple had 3 daughters and maintained a home in Howard Beach, Queens. To neighbors, Massino appeared to be a successful restaurant owner and businessman, though law enforcement had long known his true occupation. The path to Massino's criminal empire was paved with blood, strategic murders, and calculated power plays that would ultimately form the basis of the federal government's case against him. The most significant event that would later haunt him was his involvement in the murder of 3 Bonanno capos in May 1981, an event known in mob circles as the 3 Capos murder. The hit was ordered by Philip Rastelli, Massino's imprisoned boss, who had learned that 3 capos, Alphonse Sonny Red Indelicato, Philip Lucky Phil Giacone, and Dominic Big Trin Trinchera, were plotting to overthrow him. These rebels represented a powerful faction within the family, and their elimination was necessary for Rastelli to maintain control. Massino was chosen to organize the hit, a responsibility that demonstrated Rastelli's trust in him. The murder was carefully planned. On May 5, 1981, the three capos were lured to a meeting at a club in Brooklyn under the pretense of resolving the family's internal disputes. Instead, they were ambushed and shot to death. Their bodies were buried in various locations, some not discovered for years. Among the shooters was Dominic "Sonny Black" Napolitano, a Bonanno capo who would himself become a murder victim less than 2 years later. What the family didn't know at the time was that the Bonanno organization had been infiltrated by FBI undercover agent Joseph Pistone, who had infiltrated the family under the name Donnie Brasco. Pistone's 6-year operation had given the FBI extensive insight into Bonanno family operations. Pistone's true identity was revealed in 1981, and Sonny Black Napolitano, who had vouched for Brasco, was murdered for his catastrophic security breach. Massino was suspected of involvement in this killing as well. The FBI's investigation into the Bonanno family intensified throughout the 1980s. Massino, recognizing the danger, became even more cautious. He implemented strict rules for his crews. No discussing business on phones, no meetings in enclosed spaces where bugs could be planted, and absolute loyalty. He even had a rule that subordinates could not use his name in conversation, referring to him only through gestures like tugging their ear. In 1986, Massino was convicted of labor racketeering and illegal gambling charges, receiving a 10-year prison sentence. While in jail, he continued to have influence over family operations through his brother-in-law, Salvatore Vitale, who acted as his representative. Philip Rastelli died in 1991, and despite being in prison, Massino was named the new official boss of the Bonanno family. Upon his release from prison in 1992, Massino took complete control of the family and embarked on an ambitious program to restore the Bonannos to their former glory. The family had been weakened by decades of internal warfare and federal prosecution. Massino changed that. He restructured the organization, eliminated potential rivals, and expanded criminal operations. He reopened the family's books to introduce new members for the first time in years, growing the ranks with loyal soldiers. Under Massino's leadership, the Bonanno family became arguably the most powerful of New York's 5 families by the late 1990s. His operations generated huge profits from traditional mafia enterprises: illegal gambling, loan sharking, extortion, labor racketeering in the construction and restaurant industries, and drug trafficking. Massino himself lived relatively modestly by mob boss standards, avoiding the flashy lifestyle that had drawn law enforcement attention to other mobsters. But Massino's success had not gone unnoticed by federal authorities. The FBI had declared war on the American mafia, utilizing new legal tools like the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations (RICO) Act to target entire criminal organizations rather than individual crimes. Agents began building a comprehensive case against Massino, using wiretaps, surveillance, and cooperating witnesses to document his criminal enterprise. The crime that would bring Joseph Massino closest to death row was the 1999 murder of Gerlando George from Canada, Sciascia, a Bonanno family captain who had become a liability. This murder, combined with 6 others and decades of racketeering activity, formed the core of the federal government's case against the mob boss. Sciascia's murder was particularly cold-blooded. The Canadian-born mobster had been a loyal member of the Bonanno family for years, running operations in Montreal and maintaining profitable ties between American and Canadian organized crime groups. However, by the late 1990s, Massino had grown suspicious of Sciascia. There were concerns that Sciascia was becoming too independent, possibly planning to break away and form his own faction. In the paranoid world of organized crime, such suspicions were often death sentences. On March 18, 1999, Sciascia was lured to a meeting in New York. He believed he was attending a routine sit-down to discuss business matters. Instead, he was driven to the Bronx, where he was shot multiple times and killed. His body was left in the street, a message to anyone else who might consider challenging Massino's authority. The hit squad included some of Massino's most trusted soldiers, men who had proven their loyalty through previous acts of violence. What made the Sciascia murder particularly significant from a legal standpoint was that it occurred after 1994, when Congress had expanded the federal death penalty to include murder in aid of racketeering. Federal prosecutors would later argue that Sciascia was killed to maintain and advance the Bonanno family's racketeering enterprise, making Massino eligible for capital punishment. This was the charge that threatened to send Massino to death row. But the Sciascia murder was just one of many violent acts prosecutors would link to Massino. The indictment detailed a quarter-century of murder and mayhem. The Three Capos murder in 1981 remained perhaps the most significant, representing a turning point in the Bonanno family's internal power struggle. Massino had not personally pulled the trigger, but he had organized the hit, selected the shooters, arranged the location, and helped dispose of the bodies afterward. The murder of mob associate Gabriel Infante was another killing tied to Massino's command. Infante had allegedly been involved in unauthorized criminal activities and had shown disrespect to made members of the family. In 1987, he was shot to death on Massino's orders, his body left as a warning to others about the consequences of violating family rules. Beyond the murders, Massino's criminal enterprise grew even bigger. His crews controlled unions and contractor associations in the construction industry, enabling them to extort money from legitimate businesses through more illegal schemes. If a construction company wanted to avoid labor problems or needed union cooperation, they paid tribute to the Bonanno family. These operations generated millions of dollars annually. Illegal gambling was another income-generating activity in Massino's empire. His crews ran sports betting operations, card games, and numbers rackets throughout New York and beyond. Loan sharking accompanied these gambling operations. Victims who couldn't pay their gambling debts would be offered high-interest loans, trapping them in a cycle of ever-increasing debt. Those who couldn't or wouldn't pay faced violence, often severe beatings administered by Bonanno soldiers. The family's labor racketeering extended beyond construction. They even expanded into the restaurant and food service industries, controlling supplier relationships and union representation. Massino's own restaurant, Casablanca, served as both a legitimate business and a hub for criminal activity. It was here that soldiers would meet to discuss operations, collect payments, and receive orders from the boss. Drug trafficking, though officially forbidden by traditional mafia rules, was another source of revenue. While Massino publicly maintained the old prohibition against drugs, prosecutors alleged that he permitted and profited from drug operations run by family members, taking a percentage of the profits while denying any involvement. His security consciousness was legendary. He refused to allow anyone to mention his name in conversation, communicating through his brother-in-law Salvatore Vitali, his underboss. He avoided social clubs and regular meeting places, conducting business while walking or in cars where surveillance would be difficult. He swept his car for bugs regularly and assumed all phones were tapped. These precautions frustrated law enforcement for years, making it difficult to gather direct evidence of his criminal activities. The FBI's investigation into Joseph Massino represented one of the most comprehensive efforts to dismantle a mafia family in American history. The case built gradually over years, with agents painstakingly documenting criminal activities, developing informants, and waiting for opportunities to break Massino's closest associates. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Salvatore Vitali, Massino's brother-in-law and underboss. Vitali had served as Massino's representative during his first imprisonment, had helped organize murders, and had participated in virtually every significant family decision. He was, in many ways, the second most powerful figure in the Bonanno organization. In 2003, facing serious federal charges of his own, Vitali agreed to cooperate with the government. His statements provided investigators with detailed insider knowledge of Bonanno family operations, including Massino's direct involvement in ordering murders, conversations he had personally had with Massino, orders he had personally received, and crimes he had personally committed at Massino's direction. Vitali's cooperation was devastating, but he wasn't the only one. The FBI had been steadily pressuring lower-level Bonanno members and associates, offering reduced sentences in exchange for testimony. Frank Capa, a longtime Bonanno captain, began cooperating in 2002, providing valuable intelligence about family operations. James "Big Louie" Tartaglione, another captain, also flipped, as did soldier Frank Lino and several associates. This wave of cooperation broke the old code of Omerta, the oath of silence that forbade cooperation with authorities under penalty of death. Mobsters increasingly chose self-preservation over loyalty, thinking a few years in witness protection beat decades in maximum security prisons or execution by their own family members. On January 9, 2003, federal agents arrested Joseph Massino at his home in Howard Beach. They charged him with 7 murders: conspiracy to commit murder, arson, extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, money laundering, and operating a racketeering enterprise. Prosecutors would then announce that they would seek the death penalty for the murder of Gerlando Sciascia, making Massino the first New York mob boss to face capital punishment. Investigators seized extensive documentation during searches of Massino's properties and businesses. While Massino himself kept no written records, forensic accountants traced money flows through various legitimate and illegitimate enterprises. They documented cash payments to soldiers, tracked tribute payments flowing up the chain of command, and identified the sources of Massino's wealth. Joseph Massino's trial began in May 2004 in federal court in Brooklyn, and it represented a vital moment in the government's long war against the American mafia. The case was prosecuted by the Eastern District of New York with a team of experienced attorneys. The government's case was detailed and comprehensive. Prosecutors began by explaining to the jury the structure and operations of the Bonanno crime family, using charts, diagrams, and expert testimony to illustrate how the organization functioned. They explained the hierarchy, detailed the family's criminal activities, and how profits flowed up the chain of command. Then came the witnesses. Salvatore Vitale took the stand and delivered devastating testimony against his former brother-in-law. Over several days, he described in detail how Massino had ordered murders, organized criminal operations, and ruled the family with absolute authority. He testified about specific conversations, describing Massino's words and demeanor when ordering hits. He explained the 3 capos' murder, the Sciascia killing, and several other homicides, placing Massino at the center of it all. Other cooperating witnesses followed. Frank Capa testified about his experiences as a Bonanno captain under Massino's leadership. He described the oath of loyalty he had taken when being made a member of the family, and how that oath had been betrayed by Massino's own actions. James Tartaglione and Frank Lino provided similar testimony about various criminal activities and murders. Several associates testified about specific criminal operations they had conducted under Bonanno family protection. The prosecution also presented physical evidence. FBI agents testified about surveillance operations, presenting photographs of Massino meeting with known criminals. Recordings of wiretapped conversations captured Bonanno family members discussing criminal activities, though Massino's own voice rarely appeared due to his security precautions. Financial experts traced money flows, demonstrating how Massino had accumulated wealth that far exceeded what his legitimate businesses could have generated. After weeks of testimony and several days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict on July 30, 2004. Guilty on all counts. The conviction phase was followed by the penalty phase, where the jury would determine whether Massino should receive the death penalty for the murder of Gerlando Sciascia. Ultimately, the jury could not reach a decision on the death penalty, which was required under federal law. Several jurors apparently had second thoughts about capital punishment, or felt that life imprisonment was sufficient. As a result, Massino was spared execution and instead faced mandatory life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Joseph Massino's sentencing hearing took place in June 2005, though by then, stunning developments had already transformed the case. In a move that shocked the criminal underworld and law enforcement alike, Massino had decided to cooperate with the government. He became the first boss of a New York crime family to break the code of silence and testify against his fellow mobsters. Massino's cooperation was extensive. He provided details about Bonanno family operations, but most significantly, he agreed to testify in court against other mobsters, including his successor, Vincent Basciano. Before his formal sentencing, the government filed a motion to reduce Massino's sentence based on his cooperation. Prosecutors acknowledged that Massino had provided substantial assistance in prosecuting other criminals. His testimony had helped secure convictions against multiple Bonanno family members and other mobsters. Judge Nicholas Garaufis, who presided over the case, acknowledged the complexity of the situation. On one hand, Massino had planned murders and led a violent criminal organization for decades. On the other hand, his cooperation had provided significant assistance to law enforcement and helped take down the Bonanno crime family. In the end, Judge Garaufis sentenced Massino to 2 consecutive life sentences plus 85 years. But the sentence could still be reduced based on continued cooperation. This meant that while Massino faced what amounted to life imprisonment, there was at least a possibility that more cooperation could lead to eventual release, something unusual for most convicted mob bosses. Massino would spend many years, likely decades, in prison. He would live under the restrictions of witness protection, unable to return to his old life. The aftermath of Joseph Massino's conviction and cooperation sent shockwaves through organized crime that are still felt today. His decision to break the code of silence represented a breaking point for the traditional American mafia, demonstrating that even the highest levels of leadership could no longer be trusted to maintain it. Massino's testimony proved instrumental in multiple prosecutions. In 2011, he took the witness stand against Vincent Basciano, testifying about his successor's involvement in murder and racketeering. His testimony helped secure a death sentence for Basciano, though that sentence was later reduced to life imprisonment. The Bonanno crime family, which Massino had rebuilt into one of New York's most powerful mafia organizations, was devastated by the prosecutions that followed his arrest and cooperation. Multiple members were convicted and imprisoned. The family's operations were severely disrupted, and its influence in labor unions and legitimate industries was largely broken. Massino lived out his final years in the Federal Witness Protection Program under the alias Ralph Rogers. After he was recognized during a visit to a casino in downtown Cleveland by a man who later confronted him at his retirement home, Massino was instructed by the FBI to relocate. But instead, he declined and remained in Ohio. He died following a short illness at a rehabilitation facility in Long Island on September 14, 2023, at the age of 80. The case stands as a testament to the power of federal racketeering laws and the effectiveness of cooperation agreements in dismantling criminal organizations. It also serves as a cautionary tale of a life dedicated to crime. Massino achieved the highest level of power in his world, only to lose everything and spend his final years imprisoned. Law enforcement views him as a criminal despite his cooperation, while organized crime considers him the ultimate traitor. Joseph Massino's story is a reminder that the promise of power and wealth offered by organized crime leads only to imprisonment, betrayal, and the destruction of everything one has built. If you enjoyed this deep dive into every legendary mob boss who faced death row, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.